Hello everybody, and welcome back to That Was the Week That Was. This is week 37 of 2023, and after a relatively peaceful week last week, this week the tensions are once again on the rise. But here in New Zealand, the spring has sprung, and pleasant weather and daylight are returning, and once again, so is Vince McLeod. Thanks again for joining me today to share the perspective of the alternative centre, Vince. How is spring in the South Island?
G'day Bob, and g'day Internet. Cheers, it's always a pleasure to be here talking to you from an alternative centrist perspective. There's not enough people who talk about things from that perspective, so I think it's good. The spring is good. It's been nice so far. Unfortunately, it's been raining a bit and it's still cold in the evenings, but I'm enjoying the light. The longer light in the evenings really makes me feel peaceful, so I'm having a good time.
Awesome. Okay. Well, Vince, today in our first article, we see Kim Jong-un pledging full and unconditional support for Russia's actions in Ukraine, citing the fight against hegemonic forces and expressing gratitude to Vladimir Putin. I've heard lots of Western media outlets write off the Ukraine war as just a regional conflict. But Kim's statements to Putin that we will fight imperialism together paints another picture entirely, doesn't it?
It certainly does, and it comes back to one of the first podcasts that we did last year, where we looked at Vladimir Putin's speech, and he mentioned several times in that speech that imperialism, or more particularly the imperialism of the Western powers, America and Britain, the Anglo powers, as he calls them, was his major motivation for going into Ukraine. He didn't want the Anglo powers to be right up against the Russian border, and because he simply feared that he'd end up being attacked, quite reasonably, in my opinion. Kim Jong-un, he knows that there's a similar story regarding North Korea. America has troops in Japan, it has troops in South Korea, it has troops in the Philippines, and so there's a lot of American, or imperialists from his point of view, forces that are arranged just around his country. So Kim Jong-un will be thinking if it does kick off in a global sense, if it does end up being a war between the Anglo-imperialist powers and a variety of other more regional actors, perhaps not just Russia, but also North Korea, perhaps even Niger, perhaps even other places in Africa, then we could see a real change to the alignment of the world system.
Well, a few days after making those comments, Kim went and inspected a Russian aviation facility which is sanctioned by the United States. Is this another ominous message? Do actions speak louder than words here? And what is the significance of this defiance?
It's a very ominous message from my point of view, because you can see the two sides of really planet Earth lining up against each other. It seems very much like World War I again, not just the fighting, but the politics behind the scenes. Seems like Russia's trying to pull together an alliance of China, North Korea, Iran, and several other so-called anti-imperialist powers, and arrange it against them appears to be NATO, which is more or less the entire West plus Japan. So I think it's an extremely ominous message, because it looks like that both sides are getting ready for a very long-term war, and I'm talking on the scale of 5 or 10 years. It could potentially even be a world war, probably without nuclear weapons, but who knows?
Gosh. All right, well, let's turn now to Sweden. Previously on the show, we've looked at the precarious position of both the Irish and the New Zealand property markets. This week, Sweden is in the limelight for its property crisis that has throttled confidence, according to the article. What do you think of the potential consequences for both Sweden and the broader European economy of this property market downturn?
The problem that Sweden has, and the problem that the broader European economy has, is also the same fundamental problem we've got in New Zealand and in Australia and in America, which is that it's a debt-based system, and if you own a house and have a mortgage, that's the greatest amount of debt that you can have. So in Sweden, they've also done what they can to make people take up massive mortgage debts, and they have encouraged consumption so that people will take up latest cars, they will take up vacations, they will take up everything on the mortgage and pump it as high as they can. But the problem is that the house prices can't be pumped up any further because of the interest rates going up. It means that house prices are going down, and that means that this great credit card that the entire Western world was taking up everything on, it's no longer going to be available. So what it's going to mean is a massive reduction in consumption and probably thereby an increase in businesses going bankrupt and unemployment.
Hardships, gosh. Okay, so the article finishes off by saying, with rising interest rates, the funny money has turned into real money and it's painful. And then in a separate article, which is entitled The War on Inflation Has Failed, it points a finger at the Americans, saying the Fed has stuck to its usual claim that inflation was a supply chain issue having nothing to do with the $6.5 trillion in fresh cash it created to fund its lockdown economy. It makes the point that this whole financial crisis has been engineered by globalists to impoverish us, the little guys. How do we fight back, Vince?
Now, of all the questions you've asked me on these shows, Bob, I think that's actually the single most difficult question, how we fight back as the little guys against this establishment. Let's not forget that the 6.5 trillion in America, that was matched by about 60 billion that was printed up by Grant Robertson here in New Zealand. And as in America, that was also pissed up the wall immediately on the lockdown economy. And that means that we're all now paying back the inflation that ensued. So I don't know how we can fight back, because you saw that John F. Kennedy tried to fight back against the international bankers and ended up copping a bullet in the head for it. So I think that's a question that probably just cannot be answered right here and now. And we're going to have to devote a lot of time and thought to precisely how we get out of this predicament.
Okay, let's turn to Italy. On the island of Lampedusa, the little guy is also getting swamped. 6,800 migrants arrived from Africa in one day last week. 120,000 migrants have arrived in Italy this year by sea, amongst them over 11,000 unaccompanied minors. It really seems to me that this is a continuing, organized attack on Western society. Am I being paranoid? Is it just that things are really, really bad in the third world?
Things are really bad in the third world, especially in Northern Africa. The countries have really come close to their maximum carrying capacity in terms of population. And many of these places in Africa, they have the popular cultural conception that if you can just get to Europe, then you'll get looked after with European benefits, and they'll give you food and housing and so on. And that has been actually true to a major extent, that if you just show up in Europe, they'll give you food and housing and look after you. And so I think that some of the sexiest population in Africa, they've figured, well, if Africa can't sustain them, then Europe will have to do so. I predict that this problem is going to get much, much worse in coming years, and that's a prediction that's widely shared by many who have observed this phenomenon over time. And I think that it may even lead to the collapse of some societies.
Well, you've pointed out before how unrestrained migration has terrible consequences for the local middle class. And we've recently seen the appalling race riots that threaten to erupt into large-scale conflict in France. Do you think that there is a rising possibility of race riots in Italy, or even here in New Zealand for that matter?
In the case of Italy, I think a lot of their discontent was assuaged by the ascension of Giorgia Meloni to the Prime Minister's position. I think she came in as part of the Brothers of Italy party, and they thought that she was going to make a significant change to the refugee crisis. But it turns out she hasn't actually done that. And so I think the amount of discontent that exists in Italy right now must be at an extreme. I don't know if it's necessarily at race riot level, and I don't believe that we're likely to see that in New Zealand anytime soon, because we don't have the same refugee pressures. There's potentially millions of people, if not tens of millions of people in Northern Africa who would like to cross the Mediterranean and be taken care of in Europe. That's not a problem that we're realistically ever going to have to deal with because we're just too remote. So I think that we're really lucky in New Zealand when it comes to this refugee situation, and things are going to get much worse in Europe as regards the situation in coming years.
Well, staying here in New Zealand, negotiations between the Māori and immigrants for peaceful coexistence began with the well-intentioned but ill-fated Treaty of Waitangi nearly 200 years ago. And we're seeing in our elections race right now that these racial issues have once again become a hot topic. Last week, Winston Peters, still striving for relevance and being wildly controversial, made a statement that Māori are not Indigenous. This fact is commonly acknowledged by Māori peoples, but it has the Liberals fuming. What do you have to say about Peter's comments?
What I've observed is that the crux of the issue is really the precise meaning of Indigenous. People are operating under separate definitions, and some of these definitions are mutually exclusive to a large extent, and that's why there's so little agreement on the topic. Some seem to believe that Indigenous means the first person here. So the first person here is Indigenous, but others will say that Indigenous is actually a Latin term that means sprung from the land. And so a group of people have to have evolved here to be considered Indigenous. Right. Now, by way of example, in Europe, nobody considers Icelanders to be Indigenous to Iceland, because people know that the Icelanders are the offspring of Norwegian colonists who turned up in Iceland in about 900 AD, so about 1300 years ago. 1100 years ago. But it's a different story in New Zealand, where Maoris have been here for about 800 years and yet are considered Indigenous. So you've got this impossible contradiction where Icelanders who have been in Iceland for longer than what Maoris have been in New Zealand are not considered Indigenous, but yet the Maoris are. So really, what it boils down to is the fact that the whole concept of indigeneity is a globalist psychological warfare waged against white populations, especially in the New World.
Like Peters, you are part Māori, but you have been repeatedly hounded and harassed for your beliefs about racial differences for the past decade. How do you feel now that someone as mainstream as Winston Peters is finally challenging the narrow-mindedness of the power-hungry elites who have been using Māori issues for their own self-aggrandizement for the past 30 years? Do you think that this may signal that you have been successful in getting your message out?
I believe that my message is inevitable because, like Winston Peters, I've got white ancestry and Māori ancestry, and eventually, as we progress further and further into the future, there's more and more interbreeding between whites and Māoris. Eventually, the proportion of people who have both white and Māori ancestry will be greater than those who have only white ancestry or those who only have Māori ancestry. So eventually, everybody's going to have to be confronted with the fact that there's a large number of people who identify with being mixed race and who won't pick a side out of white or Māori. I think what that's going to do to the power-hungry elites is that they're going to lose a lot of potential to divide and conquer people, and so they're going to have to come up with some other narrative because the mixed race white Māoris are not going to be interested in it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, Vince, Tensions are running high in New Zealand and all around the globe, but also on the rugby fields. The Scottish took a beating at the hands of the Bokke, but the ABs surged 71-3 against Namibia. It's been so exciting and a lot of fun. Now, this is really good conflict, isn't it?
Yeah, this is good conflict. This is, I think, a lot of people say that sport is bad because it encourages nationalism or whatever. But I agree with Desmond Morris when he wrote in the Naked Ape that sport is actually a good thing because it takes the tribal and violent instincts that we naturally have as a result of our ape ancestry and channels them into something non-harmful. In the case of when it comes to sport, it's theatre. I look at it as theatre. So I think it's a good thing. I think it's a really good thing, in fact.
Cool. Yeah, awesome. So what are your rugby predictions for the coming week?
The most interesting match, I think, is going to be Australia-Fiji. Australia, they're a Tier 1 nation. Fiji, a Tier 2 nation. But Fiji have recently beaten England, who are also a Tier 1 nation. So I think they'll be targeting Australia, and I think they can win that match. This Australian team is probably the weakest I've seen in the last 25 years, last 30 years, perhaps even since the 1970s. So I think if they were ever going to lose to Fiji in a World Cup, it would be this match coming up this weekend. The other interesting match, I think, is England versus Japan. Japan is paying $14.50 to win at Betfair, but they knocked over the Springboks in the World Cup in England in 2015, and so I think there's every chance that they could knock over England this weekend. So to me, that's the match to bet on.
Woohoo! Well, we'll have to see next week how things are panning out. But sadly, we have reached the final whistle in today's show. But it's been great fun, once again. Thank you all for joining us again today. We are very grateful for your loyal patronage. Remember to smash that like button and to subscribe, and all the links that we have discussed are below in the description. If you've enjoyed the show, please consider sharing with your friends to spread the word. And also to you, Vince, thank you for your insight and expertise again. And what a week that was.
Yep, cheers, Bob. Cheers, Internet. There was more tension this week, I think, thanks to Kim Jong-un. But we're surviving still. Nothing major's gone wrong. So bring on next week. I'll see you all next week.
The Alt Centre are clown world's good guys. They don't fit into boxes neatly enough to be someone else's tools.